A few people asked me to rebuild a turbo that they had just rebuilt. I think the main question is what causes a turbo to leak oil after you've already rebuilt it? I have a couple videos that show you what to check, and probably the best one to go through would be the HE351VE inspection video. That will show you how to inspect the seals, inspect the bearing housing, and that will give you the ability to determine whether or not it's going to leak oil before you even rebuild it. There's a couple people that have asked me to rebuild a turbo, and actually one guy brought one here yesterday where the turbo was still good, but the problem was the oil drain. So I'll show you what I had to do to make this turbo to stop leaking oil, which the problem was the oil drain was too small. This turbo was blowing oil. It seemed like it wasn't really on there that long before he had problems. I think this was the problem. This is the drain fitting, and I think it's just too small. It's less than 12 millimeter. This can be drilled out a lot bigger. If it's anything bigger than about 14 millimeter, it should be fine. At least gasket match it to the oil drain on the turbo. I drilled it to a 1/2 inch, so that's about 13 millimeter. Now I'm going to take the porting tool and trim it to port match it to the gasket. Now I'm going to explain why the turbo would leak oil because the drain is too small. This is your oil drain. This is on a Duramax. You see how big that is? That one's about 20 millimeter. That's pretty common on a bigger size turbo, but these people put these aftermarket drains on here that are not on this turbo, but on aftermarket turbo setups. They're not capable of flowing the oil through enough oil through them to remove it out of the turbo. What happens is the oil tries to drain out of the turbo, and especially if you're running higher RPM and running a lot more oil flow to the turbo, then this will be very common. So that oil's coming through the oil feed, through the turbo and draining. Then you got this tiny hole trying to drain all this oil out of that turbo. And the oil drain can't keep up because it's not big enough. So that oil backs up into the cartridge, and then eventually gets so full of oil in the turbo that it has nowhere else to go when there's still oil being plumbed into it, and it can't go down the drain fast enough. So it only has two other places it can go: through the piston ring seals on the front or the piston ring seal on the rear. Sometimes it can actually come out of the O-ring area between the plate and the bearing housing. And I've also seen where people try to seal up the drain because it keeps blowing this gasket out of it. I've seen people try to silicone it really heavily to try and get the drain gasket to stop blowing out, but if the drain line was big enough, it would never blow that gasket out of there. Another thing that can happen is people will silicone so much on the drain gasket that it caves in on the oil drain up near the flange, and then the oil can't drain that way well enough. I've explained this several different times. I know it's the most common way that people have issues with the turbo leaking oil, yet I think it's more often overlooked than it should be looked into a lot more. I have several videos that I've already made to help you diagnose those problems. And if you can't figure it out, then I could always try and help you. There was one guy that I rebuilt his turbo, and then he kept sending it back multiple times. And so I ended up I kept going through it, and I kept telling him, this turbo looks perfect. There's nothing wrong with it. And later he realized that the piston ring seals were broke on the motor, and it kept on leaking oil that way. So the oil was actually coming through the combustion chamber. Oil can come up through the combustion chamber, or it could also come up through the head gasket or the valve seals. There's other places that oil could be burning off from the engine side and come out the turbo. Really common is people will do the drain like this, which causes it to leak the oil. because it can't drain properly. And then what they'll do to try and fix the problem is they'll put a restrictor on it to try and limit the oil going to the turbo to try and make it not leak oil, because they don't understand the drain issue. When they try and do that with the restrictor, usually they starve the turbo of oil, and then the turbo goes bad as a result of that, rather than the problem with it leaking oil from the beginning, which was too much oil. Seals don't blow out per se, as I've heard people say. It's just the fact that it's leaking out the seals doesn't mean that they're worn out. It just means that there's nowhere else for that oil to go. That wraps up this video. If you learned something new, then comment below.